Things that got banned because one person ruined it for everyone. Last meal larceny. It's no secret that even the worst people on this earth still get the opportunity to have a nice meal before they go. The American tradition of offering a last meal to people on death row has been going on for a long time. However, did you know that in most prisons, last meals are not nearly as customizable or as extravagant as they once were? Let me explain. Now, the tradition of a death row last meal is definitely most common in the United States. However, this tradition is actually rather old, predating both the United States itself as well as the entire Christian religion. You see, for thousands of years, across almost every culture in the entire world, it was customary to give those a last meal who were set for death. The reasoning for this in ancient times was rooted in fear, specifically the fear that the spirits of the executed would come back as hungry ghosts if the deceased individual was not properly fed before their execution. That alone is kind of hilarious, considering they are more scared that they will come back to haunt them because they were well fed, rather than, literally executed. But regardless, it's made its way through history in different civilizations and empires until it got to the modern day. For example, the Greeks would give their soon-to-be executed prisoners a final meal because they believed it was necessary for the dead to cross over into the underworld. And because they didn't want these individuals to return to haunt the overworld, they would give them a proper meal. And not too differently, in ancient Rome, they would give not only their criminals, but also gladiators large meals before the days of their fights in case they happened to have an injury or death during the games, ensuring that they crossed over to the other side without fault. And already, it's kind of seeming like the ticket to heaven is, well, a good meal. Now, focusing back in on the United States, for example, the last meal tradition made its way into the American prison system in the early 1800s. However, this practice was finally formalized by several states in the early 1900s, with different states having their own rules, with Texas being a notable example, specifically because in every state the rules varied on what the meal could be. Most states that offered a custom last meal had certain rules. For example, in Florida, your meal could be whatever you wanted as long as the ingredients were purchased locally and didn't cost more than $40. And in Oklahoma, for example, the cost limit is only $25. And in Louisiana, of all places, typically during the last meal, the prison warden will join the prisoner for this last meal, which I could only imagine is a tense dinner. But interestingly, out of all of the places that offered a last meal, Texas was notable for being one of the most generous. Prisons would typically offer large requests, not setting extremely harsh budgets on the food. This, I'm sure, was appreciated by inmates on death row. However, it didn't take long for Texas to go from being a generous state to being a state that didn't offer custom last meals at all. And the reason why the state of Texas changed this rule is because of one individual. Lawrence Brewer, like basically everybody on death row, was not a good person. But Lawrence Brewer specifically was notably bad. Without getting too much into graphic detail, the reason why Lawrence Brewer was on death row was because him and two other individuals pulled a man named James Byrd Jr. from the back of their truck after brutally assaulting him, dragging him to his death simply because of his skin color. This hate crime and murder, fortunately, was punished to the fullest degree, although it's extremely disgusting that it even happened in the first place. With that being said, even though Lawrence was on death row, he was still honored a last meal. And for this meal, he requested something extravagant. And the order goes as follows: 2 fried chicken steaks, a triple patty bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, a bowl of fried okra, a pound of barbecued meat, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge, and 3 root beers. Surprisingly, the Texas prison system generously honored this rather extravagant request. However, in retaliation, once Lawrence was presented with this food, he didn't take a single bite. He pushed the plates away and simply said, "I'm not hungry." After it became obvious to the prison guards that he was not going to eat, he was taken back to his cell, and the food was, I'm assuming, thrown away or potentially eaten by some very hungry prison guards. And if that was the case, honestly, I'm just glad it didn't go to waste. Unsurprisingly, once the news broke that not only was this disgusting inmate offered such a generous meal, but he didn't even touch a single bite of it, it didn't only make headlines, but it boiled the blood of prison officials in Texas. And it was because of this stunt by Lawrence Brewer that the Texas prison system instantly changed the rules, no longer offering any custom meals to anybody on death row. From when this happened in 2013 until the present day, if you are set for execution in Texas, your final meal is no longer whatever you want. It's whatever the cafeteria has that day. And while this isn't really the most upsetting story considering who this affects, people literally being killed by the government because what they did was so horrible, but it is still a pretty interesting example of one person ruining the last piece of fun people on death row could have. This may seem like a tame start because it literally only affects inmates on death row. And you're right, and that's because this video is only going to get more and more crazy as it goes on. And by crazy, I mean affects more and more people. So let's move on. The touchdown shutdown. I love sports. They're fun to play, they're fun to watch, they're fun to learn about. All around, sports are just a great thing that bring people together. But admittedly, I'm not the biggest fan of professional sports. I just don't watch it a lot. But when I do watch professional sports, one of my favorite parts of it are the extracurriculars. You know, fights in hockey, trash talk in the NBA, the hilarious flops in soccer, halftime shows, and of course, touchdown celebrations. But did you know that in American football specifically, there was a touchdown celebration that was so prolific that it actually got banned from the entire NFL? Well, if you do, you're gonna hear about it again. But if you didn't, let me tell you a crazy story. If you're a fan of American football, then the name Jimmy Graham is probably not unknown to you. Jimmy was born in 1986 in Goldsboro, North Carolina. It was drafted into the NFL in 2010 by the New Orleans Saints. Throughout his career, Jimmy played for the New Orleans Saints, the Seattle Seahawks, the Green Bay Packers, and even the Chicago Bears. And during his football career, he was not only known for his athletic ability, but also his unique touchdown celebration, with the most iconic being his football dunk on the goalpost. In case you're unfamiliar, almost every time Jimmy would get a touchdown, he would literally take the ball, run into the goalpost, and dunk it over the post, essentially like he was dunking a basketball. This, admittedly, was pretty badass looking, although it came with consequences because he was doing it so much, and it looked so cool that the NFL decided that no one man could have all that aura. I'm totally lying. If you look at this clip right here, you can see that after he dunks the ball, he literally bent the goalpost. And this wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Obviously, when one of the most foundational components of a sports field is, well, broken or at least misaligned, it has to be fixed instantly for the games to continue. And in the case of the goalpost being fixed after a dunk, these fixes were known to pause the game for anywhere from 2 to 20 minutes. And while these delays may seem minor, when you're talking about professional, live, televised sports, anything that throws off the schedule to that degree that isn't planned for is a major headache for networks, advertisers, and the league in general. It was for this destructive reason that the NFL ended up banning the dunk on the field goal, which, in my opinion, kind of solidified this move as one of the coolest touchdown celebrations ever, even though it was pretty disruptive and I'm sure really annoying for people actually working the game, and probably even watching too. And while this is once again more of a niche rule that doesn't affect too many people, I would definitely argue it at least affects more people and likely also had a trickle-down effect. Because imagine if you were growing up watching Jimmy Graham play football and your goal was to grow up playing the NFL and dunk yourself. If that was your goal in life and then you heard that dunking was banned, you probably just had one of your biggest dreams crushed. And while sure, you could probably dunk in amateur leagues, if the goalpost is being bent in the NFL, I can only imagine what would happen if you're dunking on amateur league nets. And I wouldn't be surprised if people dunking at home injured themselves or broke goalposts altogether. But yeah, Jimmy Graham not only made his own touchdown celebration, but used it so much he got it banned. And well, the rest is history. The sushi situation. I've never been to Japan, but it's definitely extremely high on my bucket list of places I want to go. The culture is so cool, the landscapes are beautiful, and the technology is just interesting. Obviously, here in the Western world, we enjoy a lot of Japanese technology, but over in Japan, they're still gatekeeping some of their coolest stuff for themselves. Most notably, in my opinion, the food conveyor belt. Honestly, I couldn't even tell you where I first saw or heard of this, but I just remember seeing people sitting at a restaurant and food coming to them on a conveyor belt and just being so enamored by it. Initially, I questioned why Golden Corral didn't get this instantly, but then I thought to myself, well, if Golden Corral had this, they would probably have to install wider doors so people could leave. But focusing back on the point, these food conveyor belts are relatively popular across Japan. However, in one popular sushi chain in the Gifu Prefecture in Japan, the conveyor belt was not only canceled, but replaced with a cartoon version, all because of the acts of one individual. It was a regular day near the beginning of 2023. People were enjoying their food at the Shoshiro restaurant in Japan. This restaurant obviously was known for its conveyor belt system. However, on this now infamous day, a 17-year-old boy walked into the Sushiro restaurant and sat at a table. During his stay, he had the very dull idea to film himself licking soy sauce bottles and teacups and even sushi and putting them back on plates, sending them down the conveyor belt for other people to have. Now, this disgusting video went viral, and seemingly overnight, this video had over 40 million views and was being posted on news outlets everywhere, seemingly exposing the vulnerability of this honor-based system. You know, having the honor to not mess with other people's food. To some, this instance may be considered a prank. However, the Japanese government and the restaurant chain did not see it that way at all. And this incident was actually dubbed sushi terrorism because of how seriously it was taken by Japanese officials. Because of the widespread outrage that was caused by this viral video, action was taken by both the police and the company that owned Shishiro. The boy that did this food licking was arrested, but on top of being arrested by the police, he was also sued by Shishiro for over $480,000 in damages. And while being sued for nearly $500,000 may seem steep for licking some food, you have to understand that A, that's unacceptable and just disgusting and could be a health hazard if this individual, had diseases. But even still, this video going viral was detrimental for the restaurant itself and ended up causing the Shishiro restaurant chain nearly 16 billion yen in market value, simply because people saw this video, got grossed out, and decided they wouldn't be returning anytime soon. But not only did the company lose money because people were simply not going, the stock value of this company also dropped massively because investors were speculative about how the company can recover from such a PR disaster. And because the stock for the parent company that owned Shishiro tanked, Shishiro acted quickly and seemingly overnight replaced all of their real conveyor belts with real food with digital conveyor belts that had digital food that you can click on to order foods, but gone were the days where real food would just pass you by. And honestly, it's unfortunate that, well, one person ruined it for everybody. Although there is an argument to be made that while this dumb prank was disgusting, it also did expose a vulnerability that could have had worse consequences if somebody more devious wanted to expose it. But what do you guys think? Feel free to pause quickly and comment, but I'm gonna move on. The Tylenol tragedy. If you're somebody with an active Netflix subscription and a fan of true crime, then you very likely saw the documentary recently released about the Tylenol murders. This documentary was both interesting and also shocking, because as somebody who was born nearly 20 years after the Tylenol murder event took place, it's really quite crazy to try to imagine what a medicine bottle would look like without tamper-proof protection. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what the Tylenol murders are, they're actually rather mysterious. And to sum it up rather briefly, from September to October in 1982, there was a string of at least 7 deaths that were attributed to a mass poisoning of Tylenol extra-strength pills. This event was extremely unfortunate and killed both men, women, and children. And one of the saddest parts about this entire situation is that not only was nobody ever caught and convicted for this mass poisoning due to the fact that it made major headlines, also inspired other lunatics to poison other medicine bottles across the country. That's about all the detail I'm going to go into in regards to the murder specifically, primarily because next week I'm posting my part 2 to my Killers on the Loose video. And all I'm gonna say is the Tylenol murders may make an appearance on that list. So if you're waiting for part 2 to my now fastest growing video, well, tune in next week. But focusing back in on the aftermath of this extremely upsetting situation. What happened and what did somebody ruin for everybody? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when these murders took place in 1982, medicine bottles had nowhere near the precautions they have today, largely because of this event. But the aftermath of these murders wasn't just 7 innocent people dead and Tylenol now having to put a few extra steps in the process of opening a bottle. As I already stated, when this story hit the mainstream, it not only inspired copycats, but terrorized the entire nation, as now anything seemed like it could have been potentially contaminated. And if you're somebody who experiences contamination OCD, I can only imagine that this would be a living nightmare. During the time that these murders took place, Tylenol had a 35% market share when it comes to over-the-counter pain medication. But after the murders took place, that market share dropped from 35% to 8%. And it took a lot of action from Tylenol to rebuild that trust among the community. And while these murders were undoubtedly tragic, there was at least a positive outcome out of these nearly unthinkable actions. That positive outcome, of course, being A, accountability from pharmaceutical companies and also widespread reform. For example, as soon as this crisis took place, Johnson & Johnson, the company that owns Tylenol, issued a massive recall, essentially taking over $100 million worth of product off shelves across the nation. On top of this, Johnson & Johnson established a strong relationship with the Chicago Police Department, where the murders took place, to further be involved in the investigation. And on top of this, they also formed stronger bonds with the FBI and the FDA. All of these relationships were formed with the hope of finding the person who laced the Tylenol tablets that ended up killing innocent people. But of course, the most notable outcome that came out of this entire tragedy was the development and implementation of tamper-resistant packaging, most notably being induction seals. You know, the things that are really annoying to peel off every time you open basically anything nowadays. This tamper-resistant packaging became more or less of an industry standard, and that is a genuinely positive outcome. Although it's upsetting that it took such tragedy for this seemingly simple implementation to be, well, implemented. But that's just on the Johnson & Johnson side. On the governmental side, product tampering was made an official crime to further prevent any actions even remotely similar to the Tylenol murders. And on top of both of these beneficial changes, the FDA also introduced more stringent regulations when it comes to filled capsules instead of powder pressed tablets to help further prevent product tampering. And it was with all of these positive changes, and I'm sure millions, if not billions, spent in PR, Tylenol's market share was able to return in only a year's time, which is rather impressive. But to circle this back to the entire point of this video, things that got banned because one person ruined it, let's dissect this a bit. What was technically banned in this situation? Well, I guess product tampering and, well, unsealed pill bottles. And while those are things that are definitely not beneficial, the reason why I wanted to talk about this specifically was because, well, nothing was really banned per se besides things that already should have been banned, but I wanted to talk about it because one person definitely ruined something for everybody. That being basically the trust of people to not mess with products on shelves, causing almost everything nowadays to be sealed for your safety. Or at least that's what they say. And ultimately, I do think this was a beneficial change, although it is kind of upsetting why it is required. But just so this video technically fits the theme, the thing that was banned was, yeah, you can't sell pharmaceuticals without having a tamper-proof seal. But in case you want more of an example of ruining for everybody, although it wasn't banned, in that Halloween that followed the Tylenol murders in October of 1982, because people were so paranoid about the recently poisoned Tylenol, people were extremely suspicious of poisoned candy, which is why in Halloween of 1982, it was reported that Halloween attendance across the country was at an all-time low. And grocery stores even reported that candy sales were down over 20% compared to previous years, which honestly, I believe is a valid fear. And is just another upsetting example of how one person's actions can affect, well, an entire nation. The mustache must go. I wish I had a better transition, but you know how I just talked about one person's actions affecting an entire country? Well, now we're gonna discuss how one person's actions affected, well, the entire world. Look at this image right here. What is the first thing when you think of when you see this piece of facial hair? Did you say famous, beloved comedian Charlie Chaplin? Well, I'm sure a few of you little hipsters did, but I would say the overwhelming majority of you instantly thought of Adolf Hitler when you saw this mustache. And I would bet money that you don't even know the name of this mustache. If you ever had to refer to this mustache, you would call it a Hitler mustache, which just goes to prove how synonymous this mustache is with the evil dictator from Nazi Germany. The traditional name of this mustache is known as a toothbrush mustache, and it's a small, narrow style of mustache that just sits on the center of your upper lip. And as I mentioned, before it gained popularity in, well, politics, it was popular among normal people as well as comedy legends such as Charlie Chaplin and Oliver Hardy. But if you try to sport this mustache yourself, well, nobody's gonna say, hey, nice Charlie Chaplin mustache. And it was for this reason that this facial hair was more or less retired. Admittedly, the toothbrush mustache, at least to my knowledge, was never formally outright banned, at least legally. But I would definitely say socially, this mustache was definitely banned, although that doesn't mean that there was attempts to bring it back. Probably the most infamous example of somebody sporting a toothbrush mustache in the more modern era is Michael Jordan of all people. And you've just got to ask yourself, if anybody can bring back a piece of culturally banned facial hair, it has to be basketball legend Michael Jordan, right? But unfortunately, even he was not powerful enough to overcome the stigma of the mustache. And it was for this reason that even he himself faced controversy for sporting this mustache that, in my opinion, didn't really resemble a Hitler mustache too much because he also had a little bit of a goatee thing going on. And also there's some other glaring differences between him and Hitler. Mainly the haircut. I think it's just the haircut. But regardless, not only did he decide to have this mustache, but he also rocked it in a legit commercial. And I guess nobody on set just told him to not do that. But, you know, it's Michael Jordan in his prime. I wouldn't either. But yeah, even Michael Jordan couldn't have a mustache that even loosely resembled the toothbrush mustache simply because the stigma is just so bad. And I guess rightfully so. Although it is a bit unfortunate because the mustache didn't do anything. It was the man wearing the mustache. But in case something being socially banned isn't enough for you, well, there's also a plethora of things that are actually banned due to the actions of Adolf Hitler. One of the more interesting bans is the fact that several countries have actually outright banned naming yourself or your child Adolf Hitler. For example, in Germany, Malaysia, Mexico, and New Zealand, it is all illegal to be named Adolf Hitler, which I think is understandable. But I think potentially more interesting is that in some US states, it is also prohibited to be named Adolf, although this isn't federally enforced and it's on a state-by-state basis. And another rather unfortunate byproduct of the entire, well, Nazi thing, besides all of the obvious war crimes and acts against humanity, is the fact that Hitler not only stole the swastika from Hinduism, but essentially tarnished the symbol forever. You see, I think it's relatively common knowledge now that the swastika doesn't originate with the Nazi Party. It actually originates in Hindu culture. In some Hindu cultures, the swastika can either mean prosperity and good luck, or being conducive to well-being, and it's a generally positive symbol. However, when the Nazis appropriated the symbol and used it to, well, represent one of the worst regimes to ever exist in modern, if not all of history, the symbol that they appropriated was essentially tarnished forever. Which is unfortunate because there has been some viral videos online of some uneducated person with a camera berating an Indian person for being a Nazi, when in reality, that's not the case at all. Beyond these few more lighter-hearted examples, there's a lot of other things that were outright banned due to the actions of Adolf Hitler. Although, for the sake of this video being a little bit more lighthearted, I want to discuss some that were not as, well, straight up depressing. And just to quickly save this video from getting too dark, I just wanted to say, by the time you're watching this video, we probably hit 1 million subscribers. And I just want to say thank you guys so much for all of the love and support on the entire channel. If you like my content and like what I do on this channel, please consider subscribing. We are no longer on the road to 1 million, we are on the road to 2 million. And if we're being honest, 10 million. At least that's the goal for now. YouTube does tell me that nearly 75% of you are not subscribed. So if you're watching this video and want to see videos from me every single Friday, subscribe and maybe even turn on the bell icon so you actually get notified when my videos go live. Oh, and by the way, if you really like this video, leave a like or comment part 2, and I'll definitely make a part 2 because I love making videos that my viewers actually want to see. But enough shilling. Thank you guys so much for the support. Let's get to our final section. Satisfaction not guaranteed. In the year 2025 and soon to be 2026, consumers are more privy than ever. And that's because businesses and individuals have been scamming people since the beginning of time. If you don't believe me, watch my video about scams in every time period. But with that being said, with people being more and more skeptical, businesses have had to come up with ways to convince customers that not only are they not being scammed, but if they are unhappy with their purchase, the business will take care of them. And it was for this reason that the satisfaction guarantee was established. The satisfaction guarantee is not necessarily a formal or governmental rule, it's essentially just a marketing trend and a company policy that kind of took off across corporate America. And honestly, it's a positive one that's in the consumer's favor. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I hear satisfaction guaranteed or refunds with no questions asked, I always am a bit skeptical. Although I've never really taken up any brands on this besides, well, you know, the basic refund. But I may be more of a rare breed here because I think some people get their fair use out of satisfaction guaranteed, and in the case I'm about to discuss, some people, unfortunately, well, abuse this system and ruin it for everyone. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of people abusing systems that are meant to help people and just offer fairness to all. And those people, I can confidently say, suck. And while to this day, satisfaction guarantees are still offered widely, I do want to discuss one example where somebody's selfish behavior revoked the consumer rights of a lot of customers from a specific brand. The brand in question is LL Bean. LL Bean is a famous clothing company that has had an almost legendary lifetime guarantee that it's offered for a long time on most of its clothes. The company took pride in this guarantee and used it as a symbol of the company's commitment to their product quality and overall customer satisfaction. And that, in my opinion, is noble. But as we learned in the first section of this video, no good deed goes unpunished. And just like somebody on death row exploiting a generous Texas prison, somebody buying jeans is going to exploit a customer satisfaction policy. So here's the deal. For the longest time, LL Bean had one of the best lifetime guarantees possible. And it actually went on for decades. How it worked is customers could return any LL Bean product at any time to any location for a full refund. It didn't matter how old or how worn the garment was. If you had an LL Bean garment and you were no longer satisfied with it, you could take it to any LL Bean store to have it replaced. And in my opinion, that system is so cool. But of course, people had to ruin it. And in the case of LL Bean, they in 2018 made a statement and officially changed their policy. They essentially ended and revoked the lifetime guarantee on most of their products, limiting it to the standard return within a year if you have a proof of purchase. The 1-year return compared to the 30-day return is still generous, but it's a massive shift from what they originally had. And LL Bean even said themselves that the reason that they ended this program was due to a pattern of abuse of a small group of people, and they could no longer enable this behavior. Now, with that being said, LL Bean never pursued any legal actions or dropped any specific customer names, although they did make it known that people were abusing their generosity, and for that reason, they had to make some changes. This is definitely one of the more lighter examples we've discussed in this video, but it's definitely something that affects probably the most of us. And to me, it's truly just upsetting how one person or a small group of people can truly ruin a good thing for everybody. And I know it's easy at this point to get nihilistic and pessimistic and lose faith in humanity, but understand that it only is a small group of people doing it. And while it sucks that good things are being ruined, most people aren't doing these awful things. But I guess if we've learned anything from this video, all it takes is one. The luckiest people who survived the impossible. Frane Salak. Frane was born in June of 1929 in Yugoslavia. He was born unexpectedly 2 months early while his parents were on a boat in the Adriatic Sea. Fortunately, both him and his mother survived, and it's reported that his father even cut the umbilical cord with a fishing knife. When Frane was only 11 months old, he had life-threatening intestinal issues that nearly took his life. And at 11 years old, Frane nearly lost his eyesight completely, but reportedly recovered due to his mother's prayers to Saint Teresa and a nun's herbal medicine. Already, the childhood of Frane sounds like somebody who survived deadly and dangerous situations multiple times. But believe it or not, the childhood of Frane Salek is actually some of the most peaceful times in his entire life. And the situations that made him now famous actually all took place after the age of 33 years old. From the age of 11 to 33, Frayne lived a relatively normal life. He went to music school, became a music teacher, got married, got divorced, had a child, and got remarried, essentially living the standard Eastern European way of life. However, it was that way of life that was challenged on a train ride from Bosnia to Yugoslavia in January of 1962. According to Frayne himself, he was riding this train home from work, and he was on this train with the elderly mother of the mayor of Stone. Stone being a neighboring city to the one he was born in Croatia. According to Frayne, the elderly mayor's mother was his responsibility to protect, and that he did. During the train ride on this cold, rainy day, the train is traveling along a canyon. And while the landscape of this canyon was beautiful, the conditions of this canyon were about to put him in a situation far from it. It's believed that only hours prior to this train voyage, a small mudslide near the top of the canyon caused a rockfall to land directly on the train track. And while this went unnoticed by the train conductor, when the train hit the rocks on the track, it successfully derailed the train, plunging the train into freezing cold waters. According to Frayne, after the train hit the water, he told the old woman to hold on to him and hold her nose as he broke the train window with his elbow and successfully swam him and the old woman to shore, although Frayne did sustain a broken arm and hypothermia. And while Frayne and this elderly woman did survive, the 17 other passengers on the train unfortunately passed away in the accident. That situation alone is the story of a lifetime. Although for Frayne, this is only the beginning of his multi-chapter story with his close encounters with death. Only a year later, after the alleged heroic train situation, in 1963, Frayne would find himself in another life-threatening situation. During this time, Frayne is teaching music in Slovenia as part of his service in a military band for the Yugoslavians People Party. Although, during his time abroad, he receives a desperate call from his mother, and she informs Frayne that she has been hospitalized and desperately needs him to come visit her, as this might be his last opportunity to say goodbye. Obviously, understanding the severity of his situation, Frayne books the next flight from Slovenia back to Croatia. And only hours after receiving this desperate call, he is in the air. The aircraft he's on is known as a DC-10, and while it's a relatively large plane, this flight only has 17 passengers and 4 crew aboard. And at some point during this short flight, Frayne begins to strike up a conversation with the flight attendant near an emergency exit to try to calm his nerves. This was his first flight ever, and it coincidentally ended up being his last as well. Frayne has told reporters that during his conversation with the flight attendant, he heard a massive bang on the plane, and then almost immediately after, the exit door was ripped off of the plane behind him, causing the change in pressure to suck him out of the airplane. It is then alleged that he fell 800 meters before harshly landing in a haystack in a small farm village in Croatia. According to Frayne, he spent 4 days in a coma and then woke up in the hospital, where he learned that he had no serious injuries besides the loss of consciousness and, well, coma. During interviews decades after the incident took place, Frayne also reported that the loud bang heard on the plane was likely the tail of the plane striking a mountain, causing a fire in the plane and causing everybody on the plane besides him and the stewardess he was talking to pass away. Although that's something we'll discuss more later. But in case a train crash or a plane crash weren't enough, don't worry, because there's more. In 1966, Frayne was riding a bus from Yugoslavia to Croatia when the bus skidded off the road into the river, once again drowning passengers and leaving Frayne injured, although alive. Following these now train, plane, and bus accidents, Frayne also allegedly was involved in 3 separate car accidents where he defied death every single time. The first car accident alleged by Frayne involves his car catching fire as he was driving it, nearly killing him in the process. And then a year later, he had another incident with his car catching fire, although this time the fire wasn't in the engine bay, the fire was being blown directly at him through the air vents, singeing his hair, although he was able to get out of the car in time before it exploded. And then years after that, Frayne alleges that he was driving on a canyon road when a United Nations military truck improperly took a curve on this steep mountain road, causing Frayne to swerve into a guardrail, causing his car to fly off of a cliff. However, because Frayne was not wearing a seatbelt, he was able to jump out of his car and land in a tree before his car made a 300-foot plummet to the bottom of the canyon and exploded. Now, after surviving all of these death-defying situations, it would be reasonable to say that this guy has likely won the lottery multiple times over. Although in 2002, that metaphor would also become reality, because during that year, Frayne bought a lottery ticket and ended up winning over $1 million equivalent. It was after this notable lottery winning when the story of Frayne Selleck kind of became publicly known, because after this lottery winning, he began doing public interviews, and the stories that he was telling was simply too much to deny. And he began to do more and more interviews, and these stories began to go viral. So viral, in fact, that in 2004, Frayne even starred in a Doritos commercial. And it's even alleged that during the drive home from this Doritos commercial, he hit a deer in his car, which is unfortunate and also dangerous. Now, if you've been paying extra attention, you would have noticed that I've been putting extra emphasis on the fact that all of these stories are either alleged or reported by Frayne and not, well, proven. Almost all of the death-defying stories we know about Frayne became widely known decades after they happened. And out of all of these now famous stories, none of them have been independently verified. And there has also been contradictions found within different tellings of these stories by Frayne, meaning that there may be a bit of fiction mixed in with the facts. Although I did want to tell this story because of how insane it is and how, well, popular it's kind of became. Regardless if you believe Frayne or not, or you believe he was punching up his stories or making up complete fairy tales, the reality is Frayne is famously known as one of the most lucky, unlucky men to ever live. And whether or not his stories actually happened or even kind of happened, we may never know. Frayne passed away at the age of 87 in 2016. And today, we are still telling the stories that he told. Fact or fiction, Frayne, the humble music teacher from Croatia, turned himself from man to legend. Ron Hunt. It is August 2003, and Ron Hunt is a 41-year-old construction worker working in California. He is your average run-of-the-mill blue-collar man. He likes truck, beer, boob, and he certainly doesn't mind getting an eyeful of either of those things. However, on this fateful day, Ron was about to get an eyeful of something he did not bargain for. This day on the job site started like any other, briefing with the other contractors and then getting right to work. Shortly after starting his shift, Ron was tasked drilling a hole in cement roughly 5 to 10 feet off of the ground. This task was nothing new to Ron, and he grabbed the appropriate tools. He grabbed an impact drill with an 18-inch chip auger drill bit and a 6-foot ladder. Approaching the wall on the job site that required the hole, Ron carefully set up the ladder, ensured that it was sturdy, and then began to climb the ladder and then, of course, drill. However, almost instantly after beginning to drill this hole, Ron could tell that something was not right. The 18-inch drill bit was struggling to make any progress into the concrete, and while Ron was trying to use leverage to force it into the guide hole, he noticed that the ladder was not as sturdy as he once thought. Although, almost immediately after noticing that the ladder was not extremely stable, his footing gave way from right below him, and he lost his balance and fell forward. This situation is terrifying. However, for Ron, this is something that he was trained for. And as a construction worker with decades of experience, he knew that when you're working at heights, if you are falling, you should throw your tool as far away as you can. And that he did. Although, unfortunately, Ron did not throw the drill far enough. And instead of having the drill land feet away from him, the drill landed drill side up on the ground directly below Ron. And Ron fell directly onto the drill, having the drill bit penetrate through his right eye through the back of his skull. An injury that undoubtedly would kill 99.9% of people that it would happen to. Although for Ron, this extremely unlucky situation would actually turn out to be the luckiest situation of his life. Immediately following the fall, Ron's coworkers ran to his side. And while the scene was absolutely gruesome, they remained calm and called for help immediately. While waiting for help, Ron was not only shockingly alive, but conscious, and was able to feel around his head to try to understand how severe the injury was. And when he felt the entry point of the drill on his eye and the exit point on the back of his head, he knew he was in serious trouble. Although he didn't let that situation get the better of him. Due to Ron's coworkers' quick response, the paramedics arrived only minutes after the accident happened. And after examining Ron, a helicopter arrived to airlift him to a medical center in Reno, Nevada. Interestingly, it has been reported, not by Ron, but by actual doctors and nurses, that during his time in the hospital while he was being examined by professionals, Ron was not only conscious and talking, but also lighthearted and cracking jokes. Meaning that even in his most dire times, he was able to keep a light heart, which to me is just so cool and honestly respectable. However, even though Ron was able to laugh and joke, the situation was still extremely life-threatening and difficult, considering that in most instances, this injury would be instant death. Therefore, this has not been an injury that has been often treated, meaning that the medical professionals not only had to think fast, but leave no room for error. Because while Ron was alive now, there was so many opportunities for them to accidentally kill him while trying to remove the drill bit. While the doctors and nurses were examining Ron, they were able to discover why this injury didn't kill him. And that's because the path that this drill bit took through Ron's skull was almost the perfect trajectory to not puncture the brain whatsoever. Looking at an x-ray, they were able to see that the drill bit literally pushed the brain out of the way rather than penetrating through it, which is why Ron not only survived, but also had no neurological issues. He wasn't paralyzed, he wasn't lacking motor skills or speech function, he was all there, just with a giant metal spike in his head. Interestingly, one of the first treatments that Ron received was a tetanus shot and an IV full of antibiotics. And this is because there was a massive non-sterile foreign object that not only caused, but also resided within multiple lacerations to the head, holes in the skull, and was also currently in contact with the brain raw. And because of this, there was an overwhelming opportunity for infection to take place either in the skull, the brain, or either of the skin lacerations. Meaning that even if they were able to successfully remove this drill, there was still a significant chance of infection taking Ron's life. After receiving this first dose of antibiotics, he was sent to the operating room, where the removal procedure began. And while it may seem like one of the most counterintuitive and dangerous methods, the way that the doctors decided to remove the drill bit was by using the same way that it got in. That's right. In the operating room, they put Ron on a ladder and made him fall on the ground so that the floor would push the drill bit out. That's a lie. I'm totally joking. What they actually did in the operating room was slowly and carefully screw the drill bit in reverse so that it would easily make its way out. And the reason they were able to do this was because there was no brain tissue entrapped in the drill. Because it wasn't penetrated, it was simply pushed to the side. And once the drill was fully removed from the skull, the doctors were then able to begin a massive cleanup job, making sure that this huge wound was not and did not get infected. They removed dirt, debris, bone fragments, and dead tissue, which unfortunately included his right eye. Although after this surgery and a following surgery to fix some of the fractures in his skull, Ron spent a few weeks in hospital being monitored to ensure that no infections would grow, and once doctors were satisfied that his condition was stable, he was released to go home and went on to live a normal life, and actually became known as the Miracle Man because of how lucky and unlucky this man was. After everything was said and done, the only lasting impacts that Ron had due to this event were the fact that he was blind in the right eye because he didn't have a right eye, and nerve damage to one of the nerves on the right side of his face, meaning that the right side of his face was essentially paralyzed. But beyond those two effects specifically, Ron made a full recovery, and still to this day lives a normal life. And while it definitely feels a bit odd to call somebody lucky for losing an eye and having facial nerve damage, when you understand the context of the situation, it's easy to see how lucky and unlucky Ron truly was. Unlucky, obviously, because of the accident that took place, but lucky because he literally survived the impossible, and potentially the world's most severe lobotomy we've ever seen.
Roger Woodward.
It was a warm July day in 1960, and a New York father decided it was the perfect day to take his two children on a boat ride. The location that this father decided to take his children on the boat ride was an area of water in New York known as the Upper Niagara River, the river that leads directly to Niagara Falls, the iconic waterfall on the border of the United States and Canada. This was a boat ride that this man had done numerous times before, although on this boat ride, things would not go so smoothly. As reported by Roger Woodward himself, decades after the event took place, his recollection of events are as follows. Roger, the son, his sister, and his father were all enjoying the relatively standard boat ride when Roger asked his father if he could steer the boat for a little while. His father agreed and allowed him to sit on his lap on the seat. Although almost instantly after joining his father at the wheel, the waters began to get dangerously rough and the boat began to develop motor trouble, leaving the boat essentially stranded in dangerous water. Realizing that the situation was dire, Roger's father removed Roger from his lap and tried to take control of the boat, although his efforts were unsuccessful, and the boat actually ended up capsizing in the river due to the severity of the waters they were in. When the boat capsized, all three of the family members were tossed into the water, and each one of them had a different experience. Roger's sister, who was 17 at the time, was shockingly saved and pulled out of the water only 6 meters of the edge of the falls. Although for her brother, Roger, and her dad, they were not so lucky to be saved. And both Roger Woodward and his father went over the Canadian Horseshoe Falls. Now, if you know anything about Niagara Falls, there has been numerous people who have gone over the falls, many of which who have not survived. It's actually been estimated that since 1850, there have been at least 5,000 people who have gone over the falls. And it's also estimated that there are 20 to 30 deaths that occur annually at Niagara Falls, although mostly due to personal intention, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, out of those thousands of people that have gone over the falls, it is reported that only 16 to 20 have been confirmed to survive the extremely deadly and dangerous Niagara Falls. Now, I mentioned this to give context about exactly how deadly and rare it is to even survive. Just doing some quick math based on the estimates, that's literally a 0.05% chance of surviving. Back to the story, however. Unfortunately, both Roger and his father were swept up in the rapids and sent down Niagara Falls. Roger's father, unfortunately and unsurprisingly, perished in the falls. But somehow, miraculously, Roger Woodward survived being sent down Niagara Falls at the age of only 7 years old. After being sent down the waterfall, surviving the immense pressure of the water, nearly missing all of the jagged and deadly rocks at the bottom of the falls, and not drowning, Roger was actually spotted by tourists on the Maid of the Mist boat. It's a little boat that goes to the bottom of Niagara Falls, and the crew quickly made a beeline over to the boy as they saw his bright orange life jacket, likely the item that saved this boy's life. After the captain put the boat directly beside Roger, his crew threw a life preserver and they were able to successfully bring him on board merely minutes after spotting him. Roger was immediately sent to the Niagara General Hospital, where he stayed for only 3 days with a minor concussion and bruises. There has been numerous daredevils who have tried to make safe and insulated barrels to go over the falls in, and over half of them have died. Although, this 7-year-old boy who was simply trying to have a good time with his family went over the falls, survived, and lived to tell the tale. And he has since this event visited Niagara Falls often into his adulthood. Roger was undoubtedly extremely lucky in this extremely unlucky situation, and he has gone on record saying that he is extremely grateful to be alive. Speaking of lucky situations, I would say it's pretty lucky that you found this channel. Realistically, there are millions of YouTube channels, and you could be watching anything right now. So the fact that you found my channel, to me, is super lucky, and I hope that you're enjoying this video. Now, I've never really made a video on this topic before, so I just wanted to say if you guys would love to see a part 2 about people that survived the impossible, the luckiest, unlucky people, leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so that I know you guys want more of this topic. If you're new here and haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, because we make cool videos every single Friday. But with that being said, let's get to the final entry of this list. Bill Morgan. The year is 1998, and Bill Morgan is a 37-year-old truck driver living in a camper van. Not a lot is known publicly about the early life of Bill Morgan, but knowing that he was born and raised in Australia, we can assume that he grew up playing with spiders and fighting kangaroos. Regardless, from his birth to the age of 37, it's believed that Bill lived the life of the average Australian man, doing honest work and traveling the country he loved in his camper van. A simple and respectable life. Although, everything was about to change on one fateful day. During what appeared to be a relatively normal drive in his camper van, Bill was struck and nearly killed in a car crash that seemingly happened in the blink of an eye. Fortunately, Bill was able to survive this car accident, although not by much. And while he was recovering in the hospital, it was discovered that due to this car accident, he actually developed a heart condition. Now, while most of us would consider a heart condition a better trade-off than death in this situation, this heart condition was still not ideal. And what doctors recommended to Bill was that he take a certain medication to help relieve his symptoms and protect his heart. Although, when Bill started taking this medication, he suffered a severe allergic reaction that once again nearly killed him by ironically triggering a heart attack. After experiencing this cardiac event due to this medication, Bill was declared clinically dead for 14.5 minutes. Although he was miraculously revived by paramedics and was then sent to the hospital where he spent 12 days in a coma. And during this time, things were not looking good. And doctors were actually advocating to Bill's family that they should potentially consider end-of-life planning and, well, pulling the plug. And while that sounds absolutely unfair and devastating and cruel, the reality is it wasn't necessarily bad advice from a professional perspective. And that's because previously, as we know, Bill was clinically dead for 14.5 minutes, which statistically speaking means that even if he were to recover from the coma, he would be in a severe, likely vegetative state due to the cognitive decline his brain would have experienced without having oxygen for such an amount of time. For context, brain damage begins to occur at only 4 minutes without oxygen. So the fact that he was dead for over 14 minutes paints a pretty severe picture. However, because Bill had already been so lucky up until this point, and his family was so determined and dedicated, they decided to do no such thing. Unfortunately, after 12 days of being in a coma, he not only woke up, but woke up and made a full recovery, having all of his mental faculties and being able to walk and talk. Something that has to be a statistic anomaly. But we're not done yet. So far, Bill has beaten death in the form of a car accident, in the form of an allergic reaction, in the form of being literally clinically dead, and in the form of a coma. Although, even though every one of those instances is an expression of bad luck, it's also an expression of good luck because he, well, survived them seemingly unscathed. Although, unbelievably, he didn't use up all of his luck on all of these near-death experiences. And that's because in the year following the car crash and coma, Bill not only bought a lottery scratcher ticket, something he did weekly, but he also won. And he didn't win $5 or $10, he won a Toyota Corolla that was worth anywhere from 17 to 30,000 Australian dollars. And this is where the story gets really quite interesting, because similar to Frayn's story at the beginning of this video, after this lottery winning, Bill's story became publicly televised, and it was spreading rapidly and so interesting because of how much misfortune he experienced, only to then go on and not only survive, but win the lottery. And because his story was so interesting, the news wanted to do a segment about Bill. While filming the segment, the news anchor asked Bill if he minded buying a lottery ticket so they could reenact the scene where he won the car. And since scratching lottery tickets was a pastime of Bill's, he had no issue doing such. Although, to the surprise of everybody, when Bill went ahead and bought and scratched off the lottery ticket simply to just get some B-roll for the news, he was shocked at what he had found. While the cameras were rolling and Bill was simply silently scratching off a ticket, Bill suddenly froze and the energy in the room paused. Bill turned around, looked directly at the camera, and quietly said, "I just won $250,000. I'm not joking. I just won $250,000. And then immediately after realizing what he had just said and won, he put his hands over his head and said, "Please don't film me. I don't believe this is happening. I think I will have another heart attack." Bill was obviously shocked about what had just happened, likely more shocked than us. And once the reality set in a bit more and he knew he wasn't having a heart attack, he quickly called his fiancée, told her that they could buy a new house, and she even later went on to tell the news, quote, "I hope he hadn't used up all of his good luck." And one of my favorite parts about the story is that this is verifiable, and the footage of this happening is literally on YouTube right now. I'm gonna play a short clip of it, but it is just so wholesome to see this man's genuine reaction to finally catching a break after nearly losing his life multiple times, realistically due to no fault of his own. I don't know about you, but I find that video so wholesome, and I just love when genuine, real people get what they deserve. In a good way. In my opinion, Bill is a legend. And while all of this happened back in 1998 and 1999, as of 2020, Bill still lives in Melbourne with his wife. And while he does still suffer with heart issues and arthritis because of the car accident, he is grateful for his life, even stating, quote, "I've had a bonus of 22 years. Oh wait, I guess I should maybe say this Australian. I've had okay, that's not Australian. I've had okay, let me try it one more time. Like, I'm trying my hardest. Yeah, I've had a bonus of 22 years. Okay, like, I'm gonna try it, but okay, let's just try it. I've had a bonus of 22 years, and that's the, wait, again. I've had a bonus of 22 years, and that's the best way to live your life. Every day I get up and put on my shoes, and even if I'm not real well, I still shuffle down the road and smell the roses. Look at the sun and think about how lucky I am." That was potentially the worst accent you've ever heard, but it's also a true expression of gratitude, which for me makes Bill that much more of a legend. And it's even reported that to this very day, Bill is still buying lottery tickets every single week. And who knows? Maybe soon there'll be an update to this video where Bill won the lottery once again. But even if he never does, I would say he is very much so a lucky man who beat some pretty unlucky situations. The creepiest deep-sea creatures at every depth. I think at this point, most people would agree that at its core, the ocean is simply a vessel for terror. The sheer size, anonymity, and emptiness of the ocean are reasons alone to be terrified of it. And quite frankly, it is the closest thing we have to a void on this planet. However, this void is not empty. And in this video, we are going to describe the craziest sea creatures that we know of at every depth of the ocean. Starting tame, but only getting creepier as we dive deeper into the ocean blue. The epipelagic zone. The epipelagic zone is also known as the sunlight zone, and that's because it's basically the only section of the ocean that receives ample sunlight. The epipelagic is only a measly 200 meters deep, and it's for that reason that part of the epipelagic zone is also known as the photic zone, because this is the only part of the ocean where photosynthesis can take place for ocean plants. For context, about 90% of the world's known marine animals live within the epipelagic zone, and for that reason, there is plenty of sea creatures to talk about. Although nothing as strange as the things we're going to get into in the deeper depths of this video. Now, interestingly, unrelated from sea creatures themselves, the epipelagic actually serves an important role on weather and climate by absorbing the energy from the sun, gradually releasing it over time, and even globally redistributing the energy as heat through the wind's effects on the ocean and ocean currents themselves. And this plays an important role in ecosystems, weather, and global climate as a whole. But enough about that dumb stuff. Let's get into the creepy critters that exist within this zone. As I mentioned, basically all of the marine life we know about lives in this zone, so the entries I could talk about are endless. I could mention basically any monster that's been on Jeremy Wade's River Monsters. I could discuss rare breeds of shark. I could even discuss Piranha 3DD. But even though the list of options is bountiful, this video is finite, which is why I boiled it down to a more known example. Just to start things off, relatively tame. This little guy may look like a rock, but he's actually a fish known as the stonefish. And he is both ugly and terrifying, and a little cool, but that's besides the point. As weird and alien as this fish may look, it's actually possibly the most normal looking fish on this entire list. While the stonefish may look like a deep sea creature, it actually hates the depth, and lives typically only within 0 to 30 meters of the ocean's surface. And while they can be found in depths as deep as 50 meters, they are typically never found in depths beyond that, making them a, relatively speaking, shallow fish. And that theory is also kind of bolstered by the fact that stonefish only date rich people, which, in my opinion, is quite shallow. But gold digging aside, the stonefish has some rather unique attributes that made it worthy of this list. Besides the obvious, looking weird, or at least like a stone. For starters, the stonefish has a rather unique natural camouflage that it uses to its advantage. The stonefish is typically found in rocky seabeds, coral reefs, or in shallow lagoons, and in these locations, it will nestle its body as deeply as it can into or onto the surface and then cover the rest of its body, either in sand or mud, to blend in as much as it can with the environment, leaving only its back exposed. And when the stonefish is in its hidden position, it is pretty convincing. And this is bad for a few reasons, most notably for people. Because while the stonefish could live anywhere from 0 to 50 meters below the ocean surface, they are most frequently seen by people in very shallow, low tide zones and near reef flats. And you know which other animal likes very shallow, low tide reef flats? Humans on vacations with snorkels. And when a hidden stonefish encounters an unassuming tourist, things get a lot worse than just being creeped out. And while looking like this and living under a rock may be creepy enough, the third and final attribute about the stonefish is by far what makes it most notable and terrifying. The reason why the stonefish purposely leaves its back exposed when it is hiding is because its back contains 13 razor-sharp dorsal fin spines, and they are full of the most potent fish toxin in the world. Now, you might be asking yourself, how do people get stung or stabbed? And the truth is, the stonefish is basically a booby trap. And that's because when a stonefish is stepped on or has pressure applied to its back, the skin that is sheathing the spines is pushed down the spine, exposing the needle-like spine, allowing it to penetrate whatever is applying pressure to it. And when I say needle-like, I mean it. Not only is the spine extremely sharp, it is also basically a hollow tube, and it uses that tube to deliver the toxin directly into your muscles, skin, fat, whatever is touching it. And once contact has been made and the toxin is now within you, the real party starts. Immediately after you are stung by the stonefish, you are met with a sense of intense burning, followed by a plethora of potential symptoms, including, but not limited to, nausea, vomiting, fever, muscle spasms, hypertension, and in some cases, seizures and even death. If you happen to be stung by a stonefish, your best course of action is to submerge the area that's been affected in hot water, as hot as you can tolerate, for 30 to 90 minutes to allow the heat-liable protein to break down. In most cases, this is enough to subside the sting, but in severe cases, anti-venom is also available, if you can get it. Now, if you're one of those people that are saying, well, I can just avoid this because I'll just stay out of the water. Easy. Not so fast. The stonefish can actually live for up to 24 hours out of water, meaning that if you're just on a beautiful beach and happen to see a weird-looking stone, you may also end up with a very bad stonefish sting on land. But yeah, the stonefish is crazy and creepy and scary enough, but we are only just getting started. And we're still in a part of the ocean where the sun does in fact shine. So with that, let's move on. The mesopelagic zone. The mesopelagic zone is also known as the twilight zone, and that's because this is the part of the ocean where vampires live. Jokes aside, it's called the twilight zone because this is where light goes to die. The twilight zone of the ocean ranges from 200 meters in depth to 1,000 meters in depth, meaning there's quite a bit of variation in light distribution in this zone, as well as a lot more ocean to discuss. Some sunlight is visible at the top of the mesopelagic or twilight zone. However, one distinct characteristic of the twilight zone is the lack of conditions that allow for photosynthesis, meaning no plants, no phytoplankton, no vampires, I guess. And for fish and marine creatures, this means that life just got a lot more complicated. And gross. And I'm not just talking about how these fish look. If you look at the footage on screen right now of the twilight zone, obviously while illuminated by the camera, you almost see these particles that look like snow floating around. And this phenomenon is literally known as marine snow. And it consists basically solely of organic matter from the previous ocean layer. And by organic particles, of course, I mean fecal pellets and dead material, aka fish poop and dead fish parts. And while just being surrounded by death and poop might sound bad enough, believe it or not, in the twilight zone, for many fish, it's this consistent poop snow that actually facilitates life. Because this, for many fish, is their source of sustenance. So if you were curious what a creature would look like that never saw sunlight and had a diet almost exclusively of poo, well, you're about to find out very soon. The mesopelagic zone is also the first zone of the ocean that is considered deep sea. And with that comes, of course, deep sea creatures. Possibly some of the most horrifying things roaming this planet. In the first section, I only gave one example. But for this section, I want to discuss a few more cuddly, creepy creatures, because this is where things really begin to get juicy. One of the biggest general genres of fish that exist in the twilight zone can best be explained as gelatinous zooplankton. And they come in many different shapes and sizes, some examples on screen now. And the common denominator amongst all of them is that they are basically at the will of the ocean's currents. They have no way of moving around, and they just move where the ocean pushes them and eat what they can. One specific type of deep sea creature that has a similar method of movement and also a similar look, but is not the same whatsoever, is a type of creature known as a siphonophore. And put as simply as possible, siphonophores are extremely complex creatures that, while they look like one creature, they are actually a colony of organisms that are reliant and dependent on each other, all living in the body of one organism, essentially. Siphonophores are for the most part considered zooids, and zooids are multicellular units that all develop from a single fertilized egg, and from that egg combine to create a functional colony that then reproduces with itself and continues to grow and grow. And because of this, siphonophores have been able to grow to crazy lengths, and there's even been a recorded siphonophore that was up to 50 meters long, making it the longest recorded animal on this planet ever seen. Longer than a blue whale, longer than, well, anything. And while siphonophores may just look like passive drifters, they are actually predatory carnivores, meaning that they are intentionally hunting, or it, I don't even know what to call it, because it's basically a conjoined twin that has, well, 20 to infinity twins all combined to each other. Because although this is a colony of different organisms, all of these organisms are genetically identical, making it kind of hard to categorize. And the scientific literature on siphonophores is complex to say the least. Like, just imagine, instead of you having your body, each one of your organisms was technically a separate organism working together, which I guess is technically the case. But in the case of siphonophores, that is what they are. Every zooid that makes up a siphonophore is genetically identical, but each individual zooid, or part of the siphonophore, basically has a specialized function, kind of like organs in our body. Some of the zooids in the siphonophores sting, some digest, some do nothing, and some even have bioluminescence, making them glow in the deep sea environment, which is a pretty common characteristic at this depth. But yeah, siphonophores are a bizarre collection of organisms that make one organism, and each part of the organism does its own specialized task. And while that alone is interesting, it's impossible to deny that siphonophores look extremely creepy, and the fact that they can get up to 50 plus meters long is nothing short of terrifying, especially when you consider that they are predatory hunters, not just passive beings. But taking a break from the jelly boys, we also have some more truly terrifying creatures to discuss. For starters, this guy. Sorry for the jump scare. This is the snipe eel, and it can grow up to 1 to 2 meters long, which is just lovely, isn't it? The most notable characteristic of the snipe eel is its jaw. It's very skinny and almost needle-like, and in most cases the upper jaw curves upward and the lower jaw may either stay straight or even curve downward as well. The reason why the snipe eel is called the snipe eel is because its jaw represents the beak of the bird with the same name, the snipe. And snipe eels themselves are also carnivorous hunters. And this is what an X-ray looks like. But in case that wasn't scary enough, this is the dragonfish. And I apologize for the second jump scare. The dragonfish, interestingly, could kind of live in most deep sea parts of the ocean, and they have been found anywhere from 500 meters deep to 5,000 meters deep. But I wanted to talk about them now because they are scary, and I want scary now. Fortunately, unlike the snipe eel, the dragonfish is relatively small. They can be anywhere from 6 to 10 inches, which, if you ask me, is way too big, and they are expert predators. They have enormous jaws that are filled with razor-sharp teeth, and they also have a rather unique upper jaw that allows them to open their mouth more than 100 degrees, which, similar to a snake, allows them to consume extremely large prey. Prey so big, in fact, that it is literally 50% bigger than they are, which almost doesn't make sense, so I'm assuming they're like stretchy, which to me only makes it worse. Scary and stretchy are not a good mix. Sexy and stretchy, that's a different story. Just look at Mrs. Incredible. But putting that aside for now, let's next discuss the goblin shark, another disgusting looking deep sea creature. The goblin shark is a very rare type of shark that only lives in the deep sea, and in some cases it is even called a living fossil because it is the last remaining relative of a family of sharks that have a lineage that date back over 125 million years. And honestly, I believe it, because this shark literally looks like something that was still in pre-development and was dropped way too early. It's basically an EA game, but that's beyond the point. The goblin shark is also pink and 3 to 4 meters long. And if the pictures weren't obvious enough, the goblin shark's creepy claim to fame is its flat, pointed out snout and its unusual looking jaw that it will shoot out of its mouth when it's feeding. And I think it goes without saying that the goblin shark is of course a carnivorous predator. It is also something I would never want to see in person. One cool fact about them though is the fact that their snout is covered in electroreceptors that sense minute electric fields produced by nearby fish. And it's that attribute of their snout that allows them to be effective deep sea hunters in very low light environments when they are essentially moving off feel. But quickly, before we move on to the next depth of the ocean, I quickly wanted to give a bit of a palate cleanse and also talk about something that's not so creepy but also more so cool before we get really creepy. And this is a creature known as the blood-belly comb jelly. This fish is actually known as nature's disco ball because of how the bioluminescence on it works. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a cool deep sea creature that I learned about while researching for this video. But let's move on. The bathypelagic zone. The bathypelagic zone is also known as the midnight zone, and that is because at this point in the ocean, it is pitch black top to bottom. And when I say top to bottom, I mean it, because this part of the ocean is vast. It ranges from 1,000 meters deep to 4,000 meters deep. That is literally 4 kilometers deep into the ocean, making it 4 times bigger and 4 times deeper than the Twilight Zone we just discussed, which in itself already had some extremely creepy creatures. But at the bathypelagic zone and beyond, it only gets weirder. For context, the bathypelagic zone is so deep, in fact, that massive factors like the sun, waves, or tides have basically little to no impact on life in this area, making it, like I mentioned earlier, essentially a void. No light, no sound, only immense pressure and loneliness. And it's because this part of the ocean is so isolated and so unaffected by other factors that it's believed that this part of the ocean has remained relatively similar for the past millions of years, meaning that the bathypelagic zone could be one of our only direct windows into prehistoric life that still exists today, which admittedly is pretty cool. I think that this is an important time to state that the deeper we go in this video, the less that we know about that specific area. And that's simply because the pressures at these depths are immense. And for that reason, knowledge, research, and even time spent at these depths is extremely limited. Each deeper level of the ocean only becomes more mysterious and elusive and unknown than the last, which is why I'm once again mentioning that the creatures I'm listing are only the creatures that we're aware of. And at the depths we're now exploring, there's a very good chance that there is a lot of crazy, creepy creatures we have no idea about. But let's discuss the ones we do know about, starting with this monstrosity, known as the Greenland shark. And these sharks are no ordinary sharks by any means. For starters, they are known to live for centuries, typically anywhere from 200 to 500 years old, making it the longest living vertebrate on Earth. But it's not only the lifespan of this shark that is long, it physically is also massive. And that's because it suffers from a condition that is common this deep in the ocean, a condition known as deep sea gigantism. And it's a relatively common occurrence this deep in the water. And it also makes creatures at this depth multiples larger than their more shallow counterparts. And the Greenland shark specifically regularly grows bigger than great white sharks, with the capacity to grow up to 7 meters or even beyond. Which to me is super interesting. It almost seems counterintuitive, because if you are a creature that is living in a place where food is so scarce, and you're also living in an environment that has such immense pressure, it would seem like the opposite effect would happen. You know, creatures would get smaller, not have the tendency to get gigantic. But that's beyond the point. Sharks that live at this depth live very different lives than sharks in shallower waters, and that's specifically because food is scarce, there is no light, and for that reason, hunting styles are completely different. The Greenland shark, for example, much like many predators at this depth in the ocean, uses a sit-and-wait tactic to conserve energy. They don't swim quickly or much at all, and it is really their laziness that is part of their survival, which is a direct page out of Roderick's Tips for Life if you really think about it. But moving on to our next creature, we have a classic, the anglerfish. Many people know the look, but not many people know the lore. Anglerfish famously have a bioluminescent lore on the front of their face. This lore actually contains bacteria that is bioluminescent, and it uses its bioluminescence to attract prey in the deep waters. Anglerfish also have massive mouths that they can open to extreme widths to swallow nearly any prey it finds, and it can also stretch its entire body to consume prey that is twice its size, which is a requirement for living at a place where food is so scarce. You have to be able to eat anything and everything you find. We all know that anglerfish look terrifying, but one of the freakiest things about the anglerfish is, well, how it gets freaky. It is so uncommon for two anglerfish to meet up at deep sea depths that male anglerfish have actually evolved to essentially just become female ball sacks. And I'm not even kidding. Every anglerfish you've ever seen with a bioluminescent lure is a female. Male anglerfish have no bioluminescent bulb, they are tiny, but they do have massive eyes and large nostrils, both specifically to help them seek out and find female anglerfish. Once a male anglerfish is able to find a female anglerfish, the male anglerfish will use pincers in its jaw to attach to the female anglerfish, and once it is fully attached, it will live there for the rest of its life. Not only living off of the female, but becoming essentially part of the female. Once the male is attached to the female, they combine their circulatory systems, and the male's body goes from being tiny to non-existent and shrivels up into a ball sack. And the entire purpose of this ball sack is to provide the female anglerfish with sperm to reproduce. And the shriveled sack that was once the male anglerfish is just balls that is living off of her blood and food. That entire process is crazy for multiple reasons. Primarily because men literally have no other purpose than to try to hunt down and become part of the women, but it's also crazy to see how nature always finds a way. And if you really think about it, male anglerfish might be the most dedicated stay-at-home dads. The abyssopelagic zone. The abyssopelagic zone is exactly as it sounds. It's an abyss and ranges from 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep. It continues the trend of being a dark, barren wasteland. And for many parts in the ocean, the abyssopelagic zone is the deepest depth the ocean gets to, meaning that it includes many creatures that live on the ocean floor. And it's also important to note that the ocean floor is one of the most plentiful ecosystems in the entire world. There is more ocean floor than there is forests, deserts, and mountains combined. And with how plentiful this ecosystem is, there is not a shortage of creepy crawlers, with one literal example being the giant sea spider. Giant and spider are two words you never want in the same sentence, and somehow deep sea only makes it worse. Interestingly, the giant deep sea spider kind of varies in size, and some regular sea spiders can be as small as a grain of sand, and some giant ones can be as large as a house cat. Regardless, they both conduct the same hobbies. They both crawl along the sandy ocean floor, and they both prey on soft-bodied animals, using its straw-like limbs to stab into its victims and suck their nutrients and literal insides out of their body and into the spider. The largest types of sea spiders live at the North and South Pole, and not only experience deep-sea gigantism, but also polar gigantism, another strange deep-sea phenomenon that scientists don't yet understand. Interestingly, sea spiders are typically considered parasites and not predators, and that's because when they feed on these soft-bodied creatures that they stab their legs into and suck the life out of, they don't always kill their prey. They'll just suck what they want and then go on with it, not really caring if their victim lives or dies. Oh, and these sea spiders don't only use their legs to stab into their prey, they also use their legs to breathe, with the entirety of their legs being filled on the inside with intestinal pouches that are used to absorb oxygen through the legs' tubes, basically utilizing most of the spider's surface area, which is, of course, its legs. If you're like me and don't like spiders on land, then I'm sure you're pleased to know that they only get worse at the ocean floor, meaning that maybe we don't have it so bad up here after all. But in case giant sea spiders weren't bad enough, what about giant sea squids that basically look like spiders? I'm talking about the big fin squid, possibly one of the scariest looking creatures on this entire list. The first ever big fin squid sighting was in 1988. And since then, there have only been about 20 recorded sightings, making this creature exceedingly rare. However, out of the ones that have been seen and documented, the longest big fin squid that we know of was more than 20 feet long. But because we know about deep sea gigantism and of course polar gigantism, it is very likely that much larger big fin squid are out there that we just haven't seen yet. Scientists believe that the big fin squid uses its tentacles like a web to catch its prey, or will drag its tentacles across the ocean floor to try to scoop up prey almost like a net. However, neither of these are fully confirmed. And such is the case for most of the information about the big fin squid because sightings have been so few and far between, and those sightings have been short-lived, meaning that while we know this creature exists, very little about them is known, in my opinion, making them that much more terrifying. As if their whole alien look wasn't bad enough. Like, I swear that every horror movie that has an apocalyptic giant creature that ends the world, it looks like this thing. And it turns out we don't even need horror movies. We just need something that already exists at the bottom of the ocean. The Hadopelagic Zone. The Hadopelagic Zone is the final frontier when it comes to Earth's oceans. It exists in depths from 6,000 meters to 11,000 meters, which, of course, is the deepest depth on the entire Earth, and is located in the Marianas Trench. The Hadopelagic Zone consists almost solely of trenches, and at the very bottom of the Hadopelagic Zone, there have been less people than there has been on the surface of the moon, meaning that this area is extremely unexplored and extremely unknown. The pressure in this zone of the ocean is more than 800 times greater than it is on the surface of the Earth. However, stunningly, life still finds a way to exist, seemingly against all odds. And I say this because for the longest time, scientists believed that it was simply impossible for life to exist in such a cold, dark, and high-pressure environment. But when researchers and scientists were finally able to make the expedition to these extremely deep depths, they were met not with nothing, but with life. One of the most notable examples is the snailfish. And interestingly, at least in my opinion, the snailfish is one of the least creepy entries on this entire list. But at this point in the video, I'm going to give them the pass, partially because I'm kind of over forcing a negative bias when in reality, all of this is so fascinating and amazing, but also because the sheer fact that they even exist in a place where an armored tank would implode in itself and a human would instantly die is shocking enough and qualifies them to be an entry on this list, because it's creepy and crazy how this creature is even able to exist. It makes you wonder and think, if creatures could live at the bottom of their ocean, where else could creatures and animals be that we aren't aware of? Potentially looking up, not down. But that's a different video. Focusing back in on the snailfish, snailfish have a gelatinous, scaleless body that almost looks delicate and jello-like. And that is by design. Their soft structure is what allows them to live at such immense depths. And these fish, for that reason, don't even have bones. They simply have cartilage-like structures that have been adapted to this pressure. Like many other creatures at this depth, the snailfish has skin that is almost entirely transparent. And while they may look almost kind of cute, the snailfish is also a predator and uses a suction feeding method to catch prey that is either walking on or hiding in the soft sediment on the bottom of these trenches. But like some of the other creatures we've discussed, it's the lack of time and experience we've been able to have with these creatures that leave us once again with a limited knowledge. But if nothing else, the sheer existence of the snailfish just goes to show that life always finds a way. And even when scientists are convinced that something is impossible or that life simply could not live in a certain place, life just ends up there. Further proving that whoever created all of this has a sense of humor, or at least loves irony. And I believe the ocean is kind of a reflection of that thought. Somehow, in places with no food and high pressure, creatures get bigger. And somehow, in places with no light, fish are able to create light. The ocean is truly mysterious, creepy, and if we're being honest, kind of amazing. The most haunted locations from around the world. I've touched on a lot of creepy things so far in this channel. Serial killers, mythical creatures, folklore, SCPs, but I've never discussed ghosts directly. But today, that changes. And I'm gonna answer all your questions about these haunted locations. Like, how did it become haunted? What ghostly encounters have been recorded? And are these places even really haunted? The year is 1835. And you have just been invited to a beautiful Christmas get-together at one of your friends' manors in the English countryside. The manor was just absolutely beautiful, and this party was packed with notable people, respected colonels, wealthy businessmen, and high-ranking government officials. The night consisted of seemingly endless food and drinks and music, and everything was just so perfect. Late into the night, once the party started to die down, you and a group of friends decided that it was time to go to bed, and you all went your own separate ways to get to your bedrooms. You turn down a hallway and you're finally by yourself and only steps away from your bedroom, when you notice down this hallway there's this woman, a woman that was wearing only brown clothing. You didn't recognize this woman from the party, but this isn't your house, and you didn't know everybody at this party, so you figured it was somebody else also going to their room. This woman was slightly notable due to the apparel that she was wearing, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and you continued to your room and had a good night's rest. You woke up the following morning on Christmas Eve and engaged in the morning festivities. The party was still not done. There was a huge brunch being served, and you and everybody else were not going to miss it. You sit down at a table with some of your friends, one of which being a colonel, and he mentions that last night he saw a rather peculiar woman. Another person at your table asks, what did she look like? And the colonel goes on to explain that on his way to his bedroom, he saw a woman dressed exclusively in brown robes. These robes were dated and tattered and had to have been at least from the previous century. It didn't look right at all. And the colonel was concerned because this woman might have been somebody who either snuck into the manor or was somebody who was obviously lost. But the colonel mentioned once he spotted this woman and walked closer to her and then tried approaching her, he realized this woman had turned around and he got a look at her face. And that's when he claimed that he saw this woman's bright white face with empty eye sockets, and the man was terrified. He didn't scream or run away, but he quickly made his way to his room without asking any more questions. Instantly, your heart dropped to your stomach because you also saw the same woman, but you didn't see her face. And before you could say anything, another woman at the table says, I also saw a lady dressed up in brown. I didn't see her face, but she was standing in the hallway, not saying anything and not moving. And your heart and stomach only sank deeper. You noticed that the host of the party was sitting beside you, and her face was in shock. You asked her, who is this lady wearing these brown rags? And she confessed that she had absolutely no idea. The Christmas party was a formal event and everybody was dressed in their absolute best. Nobody was wearing brown, and there was nobody in the party with sunken in, missing eyeballs. The host of this party quickly stands up on her chair and started clinking a spoon on her glass, causing the conversation in the room to a silence. And the host of the party asked, did anybody see a woman in brown robes anywhere in the manor last night? And to her dismay, numerous people in this room of nearly 100 people raised their hand. The story I just told is based on a real documented encounter that happened in 1835 at a Christmas party. And this story is significant because it is the first recorded sighting of the ghost that is now known as the Brown Lady at the iconic Raynham Hall. And this isn't the only sighting that's taken place, and it's probably not even the most iconic either. And only days after this event, when the host of the party made the staff aware of all of these claims, people literally quit their jobs and never returned out of fear of encountering this strange apparition. But that's not it. There was a handful of sightings on that night in 1835, but the following year in 1836, Captain Franklin Marryat, who is actually a friend of Charles Dickens, heard tell of the legend of this brown lady in the Raynham Manor and spoke to the owner directly and requested that he stay in the most haunted room of them all, so he could prove that there was no ghost at all, and that this legend simply came to be because the owner of this manor wanted to keep people away from his property. And let's just say he got more than he bargained for. This captain checked into the hotel and stayed in a room that literally had a painting of the apparition hung in the room. Like I mentioned, at this point, the brown lady was already a local legend and a common sighting within the hotel. And for the first 2 nights of his visit, the captain had a normal experience. He was staying in a hotel and rather comically was sleeping with a loaded revolver under his pillow just in case. And it was after the second night and the beginning of the third night when everything began to change. Because on night 3, Frederick didn't get a good night's sleep at all. What he did get was a run-in with the brown lady. Frederick had just gotten into bed and was ready to go to sleep when he noticed something in front of his door. The door never opened, but there was obviously a shadow of some sort in front of the door blocking the path. The shadow was moving and getting bigger until Frederick realized that this shadow was exactly what he was looking for. He quickly looked at the painting on the wall and noticed that this was the brown lady, and she was in his room and she was getting closer to him. Frederick grabs the revolver from under his pillow, points it at the apparition, and screams at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Don't come closer! I'm going to shoot!" But the brown lady grew a menacing grin and began to get closer, practically at the foot of his bed, when Frederick pulled the trigger, shot the revolver into the darkness, and the apparition disappeared. 3 hotel workers came into the room to ask what had just happened, and Frederick left the hotel and never returned. I tried to only tell one story per section, but I figured that story was kind of worth going into detail over. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a plethora of other run-ins with the brown lady, which brings us to Captain Hubert C. Prevant, who not only had a run-in with the brown lady, but was able to capture a picture of her, a full-body apparition. And this photo is not only iconic to the Raynham Hall, but it's also one of the most iconic photos in all of ghost hunting. This photo was taken in 1936, and since this photo has been taken, sightings have been few and far between, although many people still believe to this day that Raynham Hall is haunted. Once again, just a crazy story, but you might be thinking, okay, sure, there's this ghost there, but who is this lady and how did she get there? And because this section's getting long, let me boil it down. According to the legend of the brown lady, the Townsend family, which was the family that owned the Raynham Manor, after numerous run-ins with this apparition, was able to identify her from one of the paintings that was displayed within the manor. The woman was named Dorothy Walpole, who lived from 1686 to 1726, and was the sister of Robert Walpole, who is considered the first ever Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, one of the original Townsends that owned the manor, and this man was well known for having a short temper. Allegedly, this man had caught Dorothy with another man, a lord, and as punishment, he locked her in her room in the manor, and she was never allowed to leave. She wasn't allowed to see friends, family, or even her own children. She was a prisoner in her own home until 1926 when she passed away from smallpox. Obviously, that story is upsetting both ways, because if Dorothy did cheat, then that's awful. But Charles had absolutely no right to do any of that whatsoever. If somebody cheats on you, you just break up with them. You say, hey, you get out of my manor, we're done. You don't say, hey, I'm gonna trap you in this room until you die. To this day, Raynham Hall is one of the most iconic haunted locations in all of England. But this is one of the more tame entries on the list, and we're only just getting started. It's the mid-1800s, and you are a medical doctor, Dr. Charles Finney. You live in Atchison, Kansas, and you run a successful medical operation out of your home. This home was something your family recently commissioned, and now you were both living in it and making it your place of business, at least for now. And everything was going smoothly until one night. You were in bed, exhausted after a long day, with your eyes feeling like they're each 1,000 pounds, just begging to be closed. And as you're on the verge of sleep, about to drift off, you hear a knocking at your door. This was extremely uncommon. You obviously had no appointments in the dead of night, and you had no idea who this could be. Reluctantly, you get out of bed and head to your front door. And when you open the door, you notice a woman standing there, holding her young daughter. This woman is frantic and explains that her daughter is in severe pain, and she can't walk, can't move, and she is in endless, excruciating pain coming from her abdomen. The doctor's fatigue instantly wears off, and he's back in work mode. And he invites the woman and the daughter in, and quickly takes them to his basement examination room, where he's able to identify the likely source of all of this pain, an inflamed appendix that was about to burst. The doctor informed the mother that this young girl needed emergency surgery now, and the mother agreed, saying, please, anything to save my daughter. The doctor quickly prepped the location, washed his hands, grabbed his tools, and then began to administer the anesthesia. Once everything was ready and the medicine was administered, the doctor hastily made the first incision. Although little did he know, the anesthesia that he had administered was an improper dose, and this girl, who was already in pain, was now in even more pain, as she could could feel everything. And this incision that the doctor had just made was the final straw. Her body went into shock, and not long after, she passed away on that operating table. That young girl's name was Sally, and this story is the reason why this location is known as the Sally House. First thing I'm going to say right off the bat is, as interesting as that story is, there is absolutely no recorded evidence for that story actually being true. And it's largely regarded as a folktale, loosely based in reality. Dr. Charles Finney was a real doctor, and he worked in Atchison, Kansas. And he lived out of his practice that his family had recently commissioned. That all is true. But as far as the story of Sally is concerned, there was no physical evidence. But the reason I mention the story is because it is the story that is most associated with this haunted location. And this haunted location is one of the most iconic in all of the United States of America. So yeah, I wanted to make that distinction primarily because I knew if I didn't, others would say that's not actually true, and well, it's not proven either way, but it is highly debated and not proven that it did happen, so I'll let you make up your mind on that. That story is upsetting and sad, but what does it have to do with haunted locations? Well, that story is kind of where everything began, because after this incident that may or may not have happened in the late 1800s, experiences in the Sally House have been vast and plentiful. Some experiences only consist of hearing a creak or faint footsteps, or even the giggle of a young girl. But other encounters are a lot more sinister, with items being thrown, loud screams being heard, and even visitors being scratched to the point of bleeding. Nearly every former tenant or owner of the Sally House that had been interviewed alleged to have experienced paranormal activity of some sort, typically with consistent attributes across all of the accounts, with some even claiming to see Sally in the window at night when it was known that nobody was home. If you're watching this video, you're probably into the paranormal, which means you've probably seen some of your favorite ghost YouTubers stay in this house. Sam and Colby, Nick and Ryan, Exploring with Josh, or even large-scale TV productions. All of these people have stayed in the Sally House and had unique experiences. So for that reason, I'm not going to go too much more into detail. But I will say this. The Sally House hasn't been anybody's personal residence since the 1990s, and in more recent times has been a popular tourist attraction, which kind of makes you think. Is the legend of the Sally House real? Or do people just want to keep the story alive because there's a financial incentive? Regardless, the Sally House is regarded as one of the most iconic haunted locations in the United States. The year is 1885. You and your wife are pioneers in New South Wales, Australia, and you have just finished building a double-story late Victorian-style manor on the top of a hill overlooking your local town. This was you and your wife's dream homestead, and you built it with your very own hands. The construction was a labor of love, and now you could enjoy this manor for the rest of your life. This manor became known as the Monte Cristo homestead, and you and your wife enjoyed it up until your deaths. After you and your wife were long gone and your family had no longer lived in the residence, the house essentially was left abandoned. There were caretakers, but unfortunately, the Monte Cristo homestead fell into disrepair. That was until it was purchased by another couple, Reg and Olive Ryan, and they were dedicated to building this beautiful manor back to its former glory, and that's exactly what they did. They took it from a derelict, abandoned home to something that was actually habitable. And once again, the homestead was a home again. And it wasn't long after Reg and Olive moved in that things began to get weird. One late night, only a few days after the Ryans had officially moved in, they were heading home after an event, when they noticed that as they approached their house, they could see bright lights beaming from inside the house, illuminating all of the windows. This caught Reg and Olive's attention, and they were both speechless at what they were looking at. Reg knew that the electricity wasn't even fully finished in the house yet, and for the places that did have electricity, he knew he left no lights on and no lamps burning. Olive was just in sheer terror, and the couple stopped halfway up their driveway in pure awe of what they were looking at. Their home illuminated in the middle of the night for no reason at all. Terrified, the couple approached the house, and the closer they got, the dimmer the lights got. And by the time they actually reached their new home, the house wasn't illuminated at all, and it was as dark as it should have been. The couple theorized that maybe they were just seeing the reflections of the headlight of their vehicle, but deep down they knew that wasn't what they saw at all. And this was only the beginning of the strange encounters that were going to take place over the next few years. Following this event, when the family decided to bring their family cat to their new home, instantly the cat was uncomfortable, which is common. This cat's in a new environment and was just in a car ride, something it didn't enjoy. But as soon as your wife put the cat on the floor, it arched its back and moaned in fear as if it was face to face with another cat. There was nothing there. The cat hissed and screamed and immediately ran out of the house. You, your wife, and your 3 daughters looked for the cat and never found your cat again. Following that event, there was numerous occasions where your daughters claimed that they could see a man's face out the window, which was impossible considering that all of your daughters had bedrooms on the second floor, and there was never any unknown men near or around the property. The family frequently encountered disembodied voices and footsteps and noises, doors opening and drawers closing, and there was truly no explanation for any of it. After years of alleged strange and ghostly encounters, the homestead was converted into a museum, where it showcased antiques, local treasures, and became a tourist attraction with a gift shop, and became known as Australia's most haunted house. Since then, it was featured in numerous TV shows in the 70s, 90s, and early 2000s and 2010s. But very recently, in January of 2025, the homestead was actually closed to the public as Olive Ryan passed away. The Monte Cristo homestead is likely one of the most famous haunted houses in all of Australia. And whether or not the paranormal experiences actually happened to Reg and Olive, or if they just made up stories to have a way to make money off of the house they just restored, I'll let you decide. The year is 1907, and the Dutch have just finished building a beautiful office building for their railway developments in Indonesia. Why the Dutch had a rail company and headquarters in Indonesia is a different conversation. But regardless, this building existed, and it looks really cool, and operated until 1942. That's because the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and they wanted everything, including this beautiful office building. You might be asking yourself, did the Japanese just use it as their office building? Now it's their headquarters in Indonesia? And the answer is no, because once they had total control of this building, they turned an entire wing of the building into a dungeon, specifically for torture and executions, something that wasn't uncommon for the Japanese in World War II. From 1942 until 1945, the building was under Japanese control, until Dutch forces tried to overtake the building from the Japanese. And in October of 1945, a battle took place within the building from Dutch troops who entered through a tunnel underground. Although the Dutch weren't only fighting the Japanese, they were also fighting the Indonesians. And the battle lasted 3 days, and the Dutch eventually retreated. Once World War II ended, the Indonesian army took control of the complex, and it was restored and given back to the Indonesian Railway Company, not the Dutch Railway Company. And in 1992, it was officially considered cultural property of Indonesia. From 1992 until 2009, this building was essentially left to rot, and over this time, it was vandalized, and nature had began to take it back, with mold growing, parts of the building collapsing and falling apart, and locals beginning to have interesting stories regarding this building. This building, with quite the history, is known as Lawang Sewu, and it is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Indonesia. Lawang Sewu is very interesting, and its history alone is something to be researched and talked about. During the time that this building was left in disarray, many local teenagers would make it a challenge to touch the building, or go near the building, or go inside the building, or even in extreme cases, stay overnight in the building. This massive building with such a dark and long history became a bit of an icon for all the wrong reasons, and everyone essentially considered it to be an evil, haunted building with dark energy and dark spirits associated with it, which kind of makes sense. Like, just imagine how dark the energy is being in a building, knowing the history. The unspeakable things that happened in this building, I could only imagine left some sort of energetic residue. Regardless, this building became very popular with thrill seekers in Indonesia. And it was over this near 20-year stretch when this building was falling apart that people had many strange encounters within the walls. Hearing voices, hearing footsteps, seeing apparitions, being scratched, being touched. All of these took place within the walls. The Indonesian government actually had plans of restoring this building, but were hesitant to do so because they feared that nobody would use or interact with the building because of the fear associated with it being haunted. But against their better judgment, they continued with the restoration project. And from 2009 to 2011, the building was restored. And in 2013, the building was officially open for tours. And currently, it's a massive hit for tourism in the region of Java, Indonesia, and sees over 1,000 visitors every single day. Now, here's the thing that's kind of interesting about this building. The government has official plans to, quote, eliminate the spooky image in order to attract more visitors, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what most ghost house owners want, right? Like, they want to not only maintain but amplify the spooky image in order to bring in people. But I guess the difference is they are wanting to make this a historical landmark, but they are fearing that this image could scare people away, as especially in this region of the world, people are extremely superstitious when it comes to spirits. And there are plenty of locals that avoid this building entirely, as they fear that going near or around this building could lead a spirit to follow you to your home and essentially bring you bad luck and negative energy. So yeah, Lawang Sewu over the last 120 years has had a very long and interesting and unfortunate history, including colonization, war, torture, executions, and other unspeakable things, I'm sure. But as the government allowed this building to sit and rot, the locals decided to have some fun and found a little bit more than fun. And today, the government has restored this building to make it a historical landmark and are doing their best to make sure that nobody talks about the whole ghost part of this building, which is kind of funny. Definitely one of the more obscure entries in this list. Before we get to the last entry on this list, I just wanted to make a quick point. Originally, this video was supposed to have 10 entries, not 5. But because it takes so long to animate the stories associated with each of these sections, I decided to just essentially cut it in half. I didn't want to sacrifice the storytelling or the information for the sake of having more entries on the list. I say this because there is a ton of other crazy, obscure haunted locations that I want to talk about. So consider this video a part 1, and if you guys want that second part, leave a like or leave a comment and I will post another video about the craziest and most obscure haunted locations from around the world. Now, back to the final entry of this list. The year is 1776. You are a healthy adult man living in Venice, Italy. You have a beautiful wife and a newborn son, and unfortunately you are experiencing the harsh wrath of the plague. It's killed numerous friends and family members of yours, but fortunately you, your wife, and your son are safe. For now at least, because you have to work every single day to be able to afford to live. Your family depends on you, and you try to be as safe as possible. That is, until you catch the plague. At this point in time, the government had a protocol for anybody who had caught the plague. And your fate was to be sent to the island of Poveglia, an island that at this point the Italian government was using solely as a quarantine station for those with the plague and other diseases. And that is where you went. You weren't able to say goodbye to your wife or son as it would pose too much risk to them, and you felt confident that if you went to this island, you would quarantine and come back a healthy man and return to your family. But unfortunately, almost as soon as you were shipped to this island, you were never heard from again. Your son was able to grow up through the plague and survive it. As time went on, the plague began to go away. Things began to change. One of the bigger changes that happened was the Italian government was no longer using Poveglia as a quarantine station, but as a remote mental institution. And unfortunately, your son, through the trauma that he experienced growing up in the plague, losing his father, and other hardships that he had in his life, found himself also on the island of Poveglia. This time, not because of the plague, but because of a mental disorder that was at the time not understood. The island of Poveglia at this point had claimed the lives of multiple generations in your family. But sadly, this wasn't unique to your family. Tens of thousands of people had perished on Poveglia Island. And it's because of that dark and death-filled history that Poveglia Island is regarded as not only one of the most haunted locations in Italy, but one of the most haunted locations in the entire world. From the late 1300s until the late 1900s, this small island was inhabited by people and used for multiple different reasons. The two primary reasons, the quarantine station and the mental asylum. There was likely an unspeakable amount of atrocities that took place on this island, and it's for that reason that after it was abandoned, people gained quite the interest in visiting it. The mental hospital was the last official use of this island, but when that institution closed in 1968, not only the building went abandoned, but the entire island became abandoned, leaving the buildings, the belongings, and the history to marinate. But it didn't take long for history buffs and thrill seekers to check it out for themselves. And that's when the legend began to grow of how haunted Poveglia Island really was. I've actually watched a video of somebody not doing a ghost hunt here, but just exploring the island. I believe it was Exploring with Josh I watched, and it's kind of unfortunate because although the history of this island is rather dark, the architecture is still beautiful, and the island itself is really unique. I could only imagine it would be a cool tourist attraction, kind of like the Italian version of Alcatraz. You know how that had a really dark history but became a popular tourist attraction. Even though this entire island has been off limits from the day it closed to today, it's not stopped people from going. And it appears that almost everybody who has gone there has come back with a story, which has led to numerous different paranormal TV shows and even paranormal YouTubers to explore the island for themselves. There are no real famous notable claims of hauntings or specific apparitions on this island. There is just a general consensus among people who have been there that there is no doubt that this island is haunted, which they back up with the history of the building itself. This is definitely an example of a haunted location that I'd be more willing to take seriously simply because there's no financial incentive. This isn't something that somebody owns. Nobody's really gonna make money off of making a legend out of this. It is an abandoned building with a dark history that I'm sure the Italian government just wanted to kind of decay into nothingness. The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Lithuania. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal has walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. It is October 12th, 2001, and it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frederic Impoko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Impoko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impoko was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impoko was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing 3 other men. The same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time, it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned, once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he was experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like, seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France, and for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Payet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Payet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes all involving hijacked helicopters? Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for a murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man still living a life of crime, he wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix 2 charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Wickerson, the man who tried to give this convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. It was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a third accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These 3 men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The 3 men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the man, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all 3 men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these 2 horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these 2 didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison. And over time, were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these 2 criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in the story because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these 2 men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by 2 criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape, and once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system, and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing 2 investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks, until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night, making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools, she also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these two men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the two men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt was shooting at civilians. The police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these two men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these 2 killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, 2 good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again, escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War, something he didn't actually do because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist performed by Hines was in the multiple 6-figure range, and 90,000 of that was never found ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall. A feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty, there was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although, that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and 2 guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator. And the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these 2 in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a 3rd time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the 3rd time, he made his 3rd and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines also falls into the category of orphan / foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous 2 criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. Animals with the most depressing lives. Now look, you might be thinking you have it pretty bad, and you might even be watching this video to try to make yourself feel better. And if that's the case, then just remember, if you're alive, you have an internet connection, and you have a device to watch this video on, you have something to be grateful for. But also, if you're not one of these animals on this list, then you definitely have something to be grateful for. Because in my opinion, the animals on this list have some of the most depressing existences of all time. Oh yeah, and like always, this list gets more and more depressing as the video goes on. Starting off, we have hamsters. And I know this might sound strange, but hear me out. First and foremost, most people see hamsters as a toy instead of a pet. And that for an animal is a horrible existence. Imagine you're just a cute fuzzball and then you have like some 6-year-old kid who always throws you in a ball and throws you down the stairs. A lot of people see hamsters as a low-maintenance pet, which is ideal for a great first pet for a child. But the problem is a lot of these children can't even use a spoon properly, and we expect them to take care of a living creature? That's ridiculous. Besides the fact that in a best-case scenario, these animals are kept in a small cage their entire life, and some of the most exposure they have to the outside world is in a ball that typically gets kicked down the stairs or worse. That alone isn't ideal, but for me, that's the beginning of it, not the end of it. I don't know about for you guys, but for me, I feel like everybody I knew growing up had a crazy hamster story that all involved their pet hamster dying in some sort of tragic way. Let me tell you mine. I remember being, I don't know, maybe grade 7 when I remember talking to one of my friends. She was talking about her pet hamster. It's funny because I never saw her with a pet hamster, so I asked her what happened to it, and she told me this story. Supposedly, she was hanging out in the backyard with her family at a small family event when her uncle was building a house out of bricks for the hamster that she was playing with in the backyard. She put the hamster in the house of bricks and it collapsed and squished her hamster. And that was just her story. And I feel like that is not a rare instance. Everyone gets hamsters for literally 20 bucks at PetSmart and they think they have a living bouncy ball or something. It's ridiculous. But even if a hamster has the perfect owners and it has a great enclosure and everything is great, their existence is still quite rough. Specifically the fact that they eat their own babies relatively often. If you happen to be a hamster baby, unfortunately, you can't trust your mom because if she gets overly stressed out or if you're stressing her out, there is a very likely chance that she will eat you. Hamsters will eat their children for one of 2 reasons. One, they are overly stressed out and they simply believe that the place that they are in is not suitable to have children, so they will eat the babies to protect them from having a bad life, I suppose. Or if they are simply too stressed out, they will eat their baby as a trauma response, I guess. I can only assume that this is not fun for the hamster mom, and I can definitely assume it is not fun for the hamster baby. But if you're getting so stressed out on the regular that you're eating your own children, you can't be living the best life. Hamsters are just cute little guys that honestly deserve better, but let's keep moving. Next up, we have the mantis. And for just a bit of a heads up, this segment is gonna get PG-13. Oh yeah, we're getting crazy. The mantis, or more commonly known as the praying mantis, is a pretty cool green bug that eats other bugs and is overall pretty dope. And honestly, I don't believe they live a super horrible life, but there is one aspect of their life that I think trivializes everything, at least if you're a man. And you might already know where I'm going. Mantises may have some of the worst mating rituals I have ever heard of, which I am now going to explain. Cue the cheesy music. So when a mommy mantis and a daddy mantis love each other very much, they will express their love in a very meaningful way. But something happens typically at the end of this ceremony that is very, very notable. It doesn't happen every time, but very commonly, the mommy mantis will rip the head off the daddy mantis and eat it. And they do this for two very important reasons. The first reason they do this is so the mother can make sure that they have the nutrients required to hold and carry these babies to ensure that they are strong and make it into adulthood and exist. The second reason they do this is to ensure that the male keeps his antenna in her for as long as possible, to give the mother mantis as much of a chance as possible to guarantee her pregnancy, I suppose. As a dude, this sounds completely and utterly horrible. And as a man mantis, you have one of two choices. You got to make the decision to either never engage with women ever, or engage with a woman but understand the fact that it will likely be the last thing you ever do. For me, that fact alone was reason enough to put them on this list. Following that, we have a case that is definitely more upsetting and depressing, and that is the polar bear. Think about it. The last 3 polar bears you've seen has probably been within the context of showing how their habitat is slowly eroding, typically accompanied with a picture of a polar bear that is way skinnier than you ever thought a polar bear could be. Polar bears used to have it made. They were drinking Coca-Cola with Santa Claus and whatnot, but now, sadly, that's no longer the case. I don't know what happened when I said Coca-Cola, but I'm just gonna leave that in. Coca-Cola, it is truly upsetting that the ecosystems that polar bears once thrived in are slowly diminishing, and this is greatly impacting their livelihood. And unfortunately, this means for the most part that polar bears have turned to cannibalism to survive. And unfortunately, this is extremely bad news for cubs and mother polar bears, as male polar bears are now eating female and cub polar bears to survive, now turning the hunters into the hunted. Having your home be destroyed and then having your dad eat your entire family, in my opinion, is extremely depressing. And one thing I will note is that this isn't like the norm. Like if 2 polar bears see each other, they don't just instantly eat each other. But unfortunately, the situation for some polar bears has gotten so bad that it has driven them to this circumstance. Upsetting, but let's move on. Okay, so this one isn't that crazy, and I honestly wanted to put it before the polar bear, but I didn't want to have like 2 insects in a row. This is an animal video, not like a bug convention. And this is also an entry that I'm sure is going to get no sympathy, but I still wanted to mention it. This entry being the mosquito. They do have a really short lifespan, with men living typically less than a week and women living up to 2 weeks, but that's not really the most depressing part of their existence. In my opinion, the most depressing part about being a mosquito is the fact that literally everybody in the world hates you. Nobody likes you. Nobody wants you. Nobody wants anything to do with you. Nobody's happy about your existence, and there is literally nothing you can do to be better because you just have a week to kind of live and do some weird stuff, and you suck. Both literally and figuratively. But yeah, I don't know. Mosquitoes suck, and I think that being a mosquito would suck because literally nobody likes you. I can only imagine how that feels, having the entire world hate you and a lot of people wishing you never existed. But I feel like if nothing else, it's definitely got to make for a pretty depressing existence. And if you ever end up feeling like a mosquito, just remember, hey, I'm not a mosquito. I'm a person. I live for more than a week, and I can do whatever I want. And there is people that love me. I'm pretty awesome. And life is pretty awesome. Just not if you're a mosquito. But that's all I got on them. Let's move on. Next up, we have the anglerfish, which if you're unfamiliar, they look like this. Okay, first of all, just imagine being this ugly. Yeah, sure, they had a cool cameo in Finding Nemo, but like, that's about it. Second of all, living at the bottom of the ocean has gotta suck. Oh yeah, they live at the bottom of the ocean. It's cold, it's dark, and sure, you have this kind of cool little light coming off your head, but it's also kind of sus. Like, bro, what's this big long thing dangling in your face all the time? But besides living in almost complete darkness, besides their bulb thing, and living in extremely cold water with high pressure, or being extremely ugly, once again, they have an extremely absurd mating ritual, which I will get into. So anglerfish use a type of mating that can only be described as an extreme version of sexual dimorphism and parasitism. Already off to a great start. Tiny male anglerfish latch onto much larger females by biting into them, eventually fusing their bodies and circulatory systems. The males lose most of their organs and become dependent on the females for nutrients while providing them with sperm in return. This adaptation ensures reproduction in the sparse deep sea environment where sexual encounters are rare. I don't know why, but I find this one kind of funny, especially in today's modern like dating ecosystem where everything is so value-based. Like, what do you bring to the table? What do you bring for the table? And then the male anglerfish is just like, you're gonna have to feed me. I'm gonna be living off your blood, basically. I'm gonna be half dead, but I can give you sperm in return. And I don't know why, but sperm in return sounds hilarious. But yeah, that's the reality for the anglerfish. Cold, dark, squishy, ugly, and as soon as you meet a woman, you have to instantly start living off of her and provide her with sperm for life. I'll let you guys decide. Depressing or awesome. Now, next up on our list and our final entry is more or less of a honorable mention, or at least a general group and not one specific animal. That being the extremely sad and unfortunate existence of any animal in a factory farm or a testing facility. Now, before you click off, I'm not getting on my vegan soapbox and talking about what you should do. That's not my point at all. But I think it's important we acknowledge the reality of what's going on and the fact that a lot of animals have it very poorly in systems that we are all involved in. Without getting into too much detail, there are so many smart, cute, adorable, and living creatures that are simply put in horrible conditions for, in many cases, almost meaningless reasons. There is facilities that have beagles smoking cigarettes all day. And there is also machines that grind up baby chicks 24/7. And even if you think a smoking beagle sounds pretty cool or you love ground chicken, you have to admit the reality of life for animals in testing facilities or factory farms is beyond horrible. And for me personally, I wanted to mention it because I love animals, and no matter what your opinion is or what you choose to do, I think it's important that we at least acknowledge this.